Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at the relation between art and ethics. And the main question here is, if an artwork is morally bad, does that make it aesthetically bad? Does the moral value of an artwork influence its aesthetic value? Leni Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will is often regarded as a masterpiece in terms of its cinematic qualities, but it's a piece of Nazi propaganda. Most of us would find the message of that film morally repulsive. So does that make it a bad film? Does that count against its value as an artwork? Or, when judging it as an artwork, should we put our moral reactions to one side? So that's the debate that we will be looking at. So in the first place, we need some idea of what it means to say that an artwork is morally good or bad. And there are three things we might have in mind here. So first, we might be concerned about the activities involved in the creation of the artwork. If I murder somebody and then use their blood to draw a picture, that artwork has a tainted history. If I take pictures of women in the shower without their consent and then I use their image to create a nude portrait, again, there are some morally questionable activities going on there. So that's one sense in which an artwork might be morally bad. Second, there's the causal thesis that artworks can cause morally good or morally bad behaviour. So people often criticise Quentin Tarantino movies and video games like Grand Theft Auto on the grounds that they encourage violence. It's long been supposed that artworks have a positive or negative influence on people's behaviour and attitudes. Now in this series we're not going to be concerned about either of these things. We're not going to be concerned about moral questions with things preceding or following the artwork, questions about how the artwork was created or about its behaviour or consequences. Instead, we'll focus on the moral properties of the artwork in itself, as it were. And the primary concern here is that artworks can express or commend or presuppose certain attitudes, and these attitudes may be morally good or bad. So Triumph of the Will, as Nazi propaganda, I would assume commends a pro-Nazi attitude to the viewer. The filmmakers want to encourage you to be a Nazi. I should note, by the way, that I've never actually seen Triumph of the Will. I'm just using that as a famous example. But I'm guessing that it probably kind of commended a pro-Nazi attitude. Something like Doctor Who arguably commends individualism over authoritarianism. We're asked to support a very rebellious, anti-authoritarian character. Some songs may be anti-war, or pro-war, or whatever. This is just the trivial point that artworks have messages, and those messages can be morally good or morally bad. Just as a person can have a particular character and hold particular attitudes, and these are open to moral evaluation, so an artwork can have a moral character and express particular attitudes, and we can evaluate them. So that's going to be our kind of main focus in this series. With that in mind, let's outline the main views. First, there's radical autonomism, or radical amoralism. According to the radical autonomist, it's inappropriate to even think of artworks in moral terms. Art is totally outside the domain of morality. Artworks don't even have moral features. If we even have a moral reaction to an artwork, we're doing something wrong. So I suggested that Triumph of the Will is morally repugnant. The radical autonomist would reject this. He would say it's simply inappropriate to be concerned about moral questions. We should focus entirely on the cinematography, the editing, the plot structure, and that's all. So here's a little diagram to represent the view. Moral questions are should just not even be broached. Now this position strikes me as being kind of obviously silly. We just can't separate art from the rest of life in such a radical way. There was a recent case involving an artist called Florian Menert. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so apologies if not. But Menert created an artwork in which he put a rat in a box and had a gun pointing at the rat. And after 11 days, he would allow internet users to decide whether or not to shoot the rat. The artwork was called 11 Days. This is pretty clearly open to ethical criticism. There's a significant question whether it's acceptable to kill rats for art. Now, you might say, well, this example is beside the point. I mentioned just a minute ago that our concern in this series is with moral questions about the artwork itself. We're not concerned about actions done to create the artwork. So killing rats during the creation of an artwork would be beside the point. But notice that in this case, it's not just that the rat was killed in the creation of the artwork. The killing of the rat is literally part of the artwork. The killing of the rat was one of the elements of the artwork that Florian Menert put on display to be judged by the art consumer. So here's a kind of obvious case where we can apply moral questions to art. I should note, incidentally, that it actually turned out that the gun was a fake. The rat was never going to be harmed. But we can easily imagine somebody making an artwork in which they kill animals. I think there have been examples of that. So, with that in mind, a much more plausible position is moderate autonomism or moderate amoralism. On this view, artworks can be morally good or morally defective, and the moral criticism of artworks is perfectly appropriate. However, moral value and aesthetic value are totally autonomous, they're totally independent. Being morally good doesn't make an artwork aesthetically better. Being morally bad doesn't make an artwork aesthetically worse. By all means, criticise Triumph of the Will's pro-Nazi message, but you can't say that this message counts against it aesthetically. So, those are the sort of main autonomist positions. Now into moralism. Moderate moralism is the view that the moral value of an artwork sometimes influences its aesthetic value. Moral evaluation can be aesthetic evaluation. So that's moderate moralism. As ethicism is the stronger claim that moral value always influences aesthetic value. It's been developed by Beres Gort, and here's how he sums it up. He says that ethicism is the claim that if a work manifests ethically reprehensible attitudes, it is to that extent aesthetically defective, and if a work manifests ethically commendable attitudes, it is to that extent aesthetically meritorious. So moderate moralism claims that a moral defect is sometimes an aesthetic defect. Ethicism claims that a moral defect is always an aesthetic defect. The moral properties of an artwork are always among its aesthetic properties. Radical moralism is the view that the aesthetic value is the view that aesthetic value is constrained by moral value, such that if an artwork is morally good, then it's aesthetically good, and if an artwork is morally bad, then it's aesthetically bad. So although other things might be aesthetically relevant, the central aesthetic value is moral value. So on ethicism and moderate moralism, we can say that Triumph of the Will is a good film overall. It's just that the moral badness of its message counts against it. The moral value is just one consideration among many. On radical moralism, moral value is a kind of trump card. It doesn't matter how many other virtues Triumph of the Will has, it's an aesthetically bad film. I think this is an even more absurd position than radical amoralism, but apparently some people have held it. Leo Tolstoy is sometimes cited as being a radical moralist. Tolstoy argued that the essential function of art was the expression of emotion, and he felt that morally virtuous emotions such as religious sentiments and expressions of love and support for the unity and brotherhood of mankind and so on were of central importance. Expressing morally virtuous emotions is literally the point of art for Tolstoy. That's literally what art is for. So you can kind of see how that might lead to this idea that central to aesthetic value is moral value. But I think this position is fairly silly. Anyway, there's a little diagram of it. Now, you could also reject autonomism by adopting immoralism. You could hold that if an artwork is morally bad, this makes it aesthetically better. So the standard assumption seems to be that if moral value influences aesthetic value, it must be a positive correlation. The better it is morally, the better it is aesthetically. But we might take the view that the relationship is negative. Moral badness can make the work aesthetically good. And an intuitive case of this might be comedies and humour. There do seem to be cases where the moral badness of a joke makes it funnier. Sometimes a joke might be so offensive or outrageous that you can't help but laugh at it. This example is debatable because arguably standard examples of morally bad jokes turn out not to be morally bad. So take the joke. So here's an example of a potentially morally bad joke. A Jewish boy asks his mother if he can borrow $20 to see a movie. His mother responds, $15? Since when does it cost $10 to see a movie? That's a plausible example of a joke which is morally bad. And we might think, if we find it funny, that its moral outrageousness is part of what makes it funny. But on the other hand, we could argue that it's not really morally bad, because although the joke presupposes a rather unpleasant stereotype about Jews, we're only pretending. We don't really believe the stereotype. Whether or not that joke counts as morally bad depends on the context, and in the context of a bunch of enlightened and unprejudiced people saying it, it's not bad. So we can debate this example, but the point is, for now, there's clearly a plausible case for immoralism about humour, for the idea that humour is made funnier by being morally bad, and we might wonder if this can extend to other forms of art. Finally, we can combine moralism and immoralism into variabilism, which is the view that sometimes moral value correlates positively with aesthetic value, sometimes it correlates negatively. So if an artwork is morally bad, this can be an aesthetic virtue or it can be an aesthetic vice. It just depends on the artwork. This is a view that I find most plausible personally. But anyway, we can diagram the available views as follows. Now, I don't know of any philosopher who has held any version of immoralism in the sense that I'm defining it. People who are attracted to the idea that aesthetic value could be increased by moral disvalue tend to go for variabilism. But I thought I might as well mention the whole space of possible views. I'm not going to discuss immoralism in much detail, though. Also, I'm not going to discuss radical autonomism or radical moralism any further because I think those views are just silly. So we'll focus on the more plausible moderate views. The real debate then is between moderate autonomism, ethicism, moderate moralism, and variabilism. And that's what we will look at throughout the next few videos. But that's it by way of introduction.